We're going to start off listening to Reverend Greg Jarrell. Reverend Jarrell is the founder of QC Family Tree with his wife, Helms Jarrell. They started this in 2005. It's an intentional Christian community, forming relationships and seeking justice alongside the residents of the Inderley Park neighborhood in Charlotte. Greg co-directs QC Family Tree with his wife, Helms, and his larger family. Greg has also been doing research on the history of urban renewal in Charlotte, uncovering quite a bit about the redlining and segregation that have led to our poverty and our current housing patterns now. Let me turn it over to you, Reverend Jarrell. I'll give you 5 minutes to testify.
All right, thanks, Rodney. So since I've got 5 minutes, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour through how Charlotte became where we've been since 1900. And I'm going to try to keep it as succinct as possible, highlighting a couple of key stories that I think really illustrate this well. So it's important for you to know that the Civil War ended in 1865, but segregation didn't really get invented beyond after that until about the year 1900, which is when Jim Crow came along. And as Jim Crow was being established following the election of 1898 and then into the election of 1900, residents in Charlotte began to be, as our local historian Tom Hanchett says, sorted out by race into different neighborhoods. And the most largest concentration of Black residents in Charlotte at that point was in the Second Ward neighborhood, which folks there had come to call Brooklyn, which has been in the news and becoming more in people's consciousness lately. So segregation begins to be formally enforced at that point, but then government policy goes on to reinforce that segregation and to reinforce the segregation of money alongside the segregation of people so that capital only flows in the direction of white neighborhoods. Most famously, that was done through a New Deal program called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, founded in 1933, and these are the groups that produced redlining maps. You saw in Dr. Thomas's presentation a picture of the Charlotte redlining map. My research is especially focused on religious history, the way that churches participated in the lead up to and the follow-up of urban renewal. And you should know that leading churchmen in Charlotte helped to produce that redlining map. And so as we consider that, especially as clergy myself, it's important to know that our churches, our white churches, have been highly implicated in the injustices that happen. Functionally, what redlining did was starved already poor communities for capital, which is to say for money. And so it was hard to get a loan. It was hard to start a business. It was hard to buy a house, and only a small number of Black residents in those areas were ever able to do that. There were some prominent areas and some areas where some kind of high-class areas within the Brooklyn neighborhood in particular, but most of those areas were of low quality, quality that the NAACP in 1950 even called slums, because they were run by slumlords who were white families that owned large portions of those properties and kept them in poor condition. So in 1950, the NAACP locally put forward a 10-point program that they said could resolve some of these issues. And what they did, very interestingly, was to tie together housing and the other policies of segregation. And so they were able to see that all of this was of one accord. Housing and water fountains and separate schools and separate facilities were all tied together. The NAACP was talking about this in 1950. What the city council began to do at that point, though, was to form what was called the Redevelopment Commission, which said, rather than adopting the NAACP's proposal, there's all kinds of federal money available now with this new program called Urban Renewal. And so they formed a Redevelopment Commission. Interestingly enough, they found in the first neighborhoods they looked at to take by urban renewal that they wanted to call them slums. I see I've got 1 minute left, but they weren't blighted enough for the state government to let them get away with tearing them down. So they actually had to abandon the redevelopment commission for about 5 years before they brought it back. At that point, in 1958, they reformed it and set their sights on the Brooklyn neighborhood, Second Ward, to take over and to move people. Embarrassingly, they had to stop in 1962 because the federal government called them out. They were taking houses, displacing more than 1,000 families that lived there in 1960, but were refusing to build anywhere else. And the real estate lobby had said, we're not going to build new housing. We're going to let the market absorb this. But the market had created the problem. There was no way that the market was going to absorb the problem. And the last thing, since I'm out of time here, that I'd want to tell you at this point is that what happened over the course of that, we left behind neighborhoods and we got highways instead. And Greg Jackson's going to be able to speak really powerfully to his neighborhood, which is located right next to one of those highways. But we also transferred wealth. So wealth had been built in communities like Brooklyn. Not the kind of wealth that was built in Myers Park because of the policies that kept money from flowing in that direction. But wealth had been built in Brooklyn, and it was transferred from the people who lived there to white institutions. I've done the math, and if you were forced to sell in Brooklyn and you bought in a West Side neighborhood like Oak Lawn Park, Washington Heights, Enderley Park, then the difference in the appreciation you would have gained from that forced sale is about 14 times. So, and that's in constant $20. So if you were forced to sell in Brooklyn, you bought for the same price in a West Side neighborhood, your property is now worth 1/14 of the property of the value of the property now as it currently sits in Second Ward.
Thank you so much for those frightening statistics there, Greg, and for laying that background for us. I'll start off with you, Reverend Jarrell, and the first question I have for you is, you mentioned the role of that that people within the white church played in the redlining of Charlotte. What do you think the responsibility of faith communities in Charlotte should be towards providing atonement for what took place?
I think the first thing is to uncover the stories. It is there, as I'm writing some of this research, I've keyed in on this magnificent quote from James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time. He says, "It is not permissible that the authors of destruction should be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime."
Mm.
And to me, that's the first step. We have to, our white churches have to stop narrating the story of our own innocence and to face up to the legacy of what conservative and progressive, fundamentalist and liberal churches all participated in together. And so to me, that's the first step. And once we can tell the story truthfully, I think the next steps become a little more clear.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Jarrell. Let's see if we have some chance to ask some questions of you in just a moment.